But my interest piqued. I said, well, what about the resource gain? Can servant leaders benefit themselves on a daily basis from enacting servant leadership behaviors? And so one way is, well, you're having a positive impact on those around you. Shouldn't that be rewarding? Shouldn't that be fulfilling? Shouldn't that create a pleasurable experience? So Tom Thibodeau said something yesterday. He said, on days when I engage in more servant leadership behaviors, I feel this immense sense of joy. Right? So servant leadership behaviors might produce a positive affective experience for those leaders as they serve the employees around them. But in terms of theory, process, outcomes, how all of this unfolds is somewhat amorphous, right? Well, there's not a lot going on here in the research space. And so my research question today is, how and for whom are servant leadership behaviors resource generated? What does that process look like? What are the outcomes? What does resource gain mean for a servant leader? Okay, so I'm starting with the assumption that servant leadership behaviors create this positive affective experience, right? It creates this joy. And then we turn to broaden and build theory to explain the how. So essentially, Fredrickson, in a number of papers, suggests that there's something special about positive emotions. Positive emotions broadens people's cognitions. There's been studies on eye tracking. They're literally their visualization is broadened. They make new and novel connections between things that they hadn't considered previously. And they can look at their work in a new way. So there's something magical or good about positive emotions. And by consequence, people can build 3 different types of resources. So Fredrickson, across a ton of studies, consistently refers back to these 3 different categories, if you will, of resources, which are physiological resources, psychological resources, and then relational resources. All right, so physiological. So I think of this as your body battery. How much energy do you have in the latter half of your day? Right? And so on days when you're enacting more servant leadership behaviors, you experience this positive affect. Can you experience more energy? Can it be re-energizing? Right? So vitality is known colloquially as people's fuel for everyday living. Can servant leadership be re-energizing for the leader? And so what's the role of positive affect in this process? Positive affect enables you to see your work in a new light. It enables you to look at your work in servant leadership behaviors in particular, and see them as resource generating, as contributing to your overall resources, as opposed to something that's just a tax on your time and your energy. Psychological, so we operationalize this as motivation. So motivation can be a psychological resource that you can use to your advantage to direct the intensity and persistence of effort towards goal accomplishment. And so on days when servant leadership behaviors are high, you might want to move, right? Direct more effort towards your work tasks. And so what's the role of positive affect in this? Positive affect enables you to see your work in a new light. Really extract the things that are fun and enjoyable. So you're enacting servant leadership behaviors, you extract more fun and enjoyment in the work itself. And it makes you want to expend more effort, expend more energy on the latter half of your workday. And then finally, relational. So servant leadership is, as you all know, an inherently relational set of behaviors. It enables the leader to foster and cultivate strong interpersonal bonds with their employees. And so on days when servant leadership behaviors are high, they experience more positive affect, and the work itself becomes imbued with more meaning because they're establishing these stronger relationships with others. And so this is the overall process through which we believe servant leadership behaviors can be resource generating. The magic of this positive affective experience. And so the next question is always, okay, well, can all leaders benefit from these resource generating effects? And so in other words, for whom, right? For whom is resource generation going to happen? And so something that we talked about yesterday was this moral cognitive development. We talked about how people are at different stages of their servant leadership development, their servant leadership journey. Some people may not have started. Some people may be completely and fully bought into the essence of servant leadership and see themselves have the heart of a servant, right? And see themselves as one who is servant first. And so Peter Sun's work shed some light on this moral cognitive development process. And so essentially what he does is he decouples who a person is, i.e. their self-concept, from what they actually do, and suggests that there's 3 different stages of moral cognitive development for servant leaders. Stage 1 is that leaders are driven by self-enhancement values and do not see themselves as an altruistic person who's servant first. So why would this individual engage in servant leadership behaviors? Well, we heard yesterday from some of our practitioner colleagues that sometimes there are organizations that are trying to promote servant leadership behaviors, right, at work. And so I might not fully embrace servant leadership, but I'm going to do it anyways to comply with what my organization is expecting of me. You may also do so out of necessity. Perhaps you see an employee that's struggling with an interpersonal issue, and you're like, man, I'm not going to get anything out of this employee unless I figure out what's going on with them. So they're not doing so because they really deeply care. They're looking at the consequences, the action consequences, and the lack of productivity that's going to happen. So this is stage 1. It gets better, hopefully, I promise, right? So hopefully, right, you probably know some people that are in stage 1. Stage 2 is you're starting to shift your mindset away from self-interest, right? And serving followers begins to become stem from a higher calling. So you start building that heart of or mindset of a servant. And then stage 3, you're fully bought into servant leadership. So you're totally encapsulated by the self-subordinating ethos that undergirds servant leadership theory. And so this moral transformation process that occurs is also reflected in the definition, Eberdahl's definition of servant leadership. Right? It says that leaders undergo an outward reorientation away from self-concern toward concern for others. And so we operationalize this as self-enhancement values. So you can think of people with, at stage 1, high levels of self-enhancement values. Are they going to experience a lot of positive affect associated with enacting servant leadership behaviors? If they don't see the value in servant leadership behaviors, are they going to experience joy from these behaviors? Maybe not. And then compare that to somebody who's lower on self-enhancement values. They've begun that value transformation process away from self-concern towards other concern. These individuals are more likely to experience positive affect and then benefit from the downstream resource regeneration. All right. So in terms of methodology, snowball sampling, meaning we cast a wide net. We recruited leaders from a wide variety of industries. We sent out a one-time survey, which captured our between-person variable, self-enhancement values, and then demographic data. And then we sent them, 2 weeks later, we sent leaders 2 surveys a day for 2 consecutive work weeks. So the first survey, sent it to them at noon, sent them the servant leadership and then the positive affect scale, and then later that day in the afternoon, while they're still at work, so these are resources while they're still at work, not at home, 3:30 we sent them leader vitality, intrinsic motivation, and then meaningfulness. We also can't close the surveys after 2 hours, so people were not able to go and backfill their responses, which is really important. We retained individuals that completed at least 3 cycles. That's a best practice in the field. Final sample, 44 leaders, 352 completed cycles, or days. All right, in terms of measures, valid and reliable scales, we could talk about those more in depth at our roundtables. I won't spend too much time there. All right, so in terms of analytic approach, M plus 8.1 was used the Bayesian estimator. Following best practices, we centered the within-person variable, which was within-person predictor, which was servant leadership, and then grand mean centered our level 2 moderator there. All hypothesized paths were run using random slopes, again, a best practice. And then our 3 criterion variables, our 3 resources were allowed to covary in the model, and that's important because if we get into further discussions, right, there was some correlation between those outcomes. So it's important to establish discriminant validity there. All right, so then we tested this model without any control variables, and then also with control variables, and overall we didn't see any meaningful differences in the strength and direction of the effects. So here was our findings. So supporting our hypothesis, there's a negative moderation effect. So high levels of self-enhancement values, people that are more self-enhancing, were less likely to experience the positive affect, the joy associated with enacting servant leadership behaviors. There was no statistically significant relationship there. And then this relationship was very strong and positive for people with lower levels of self-enhancement values. And then we see that there are positive regression coefficients with our 3 outcomes that we have listed there. All right, so here's the moneymaker, right? Interaction effect that everybody wants to see. So, so you can't see there. So I'll kind of direct your attention over here so that this works. So at low, this line here is low self-enhancement values. So people that are buying into servant leadership, we see that there's a strong positive correlation between servant leadership behaviors and their positive affect. By contrast, people with high self-enhancement values, more focused on their personal concern, there's a slight looking negative relationship, although this this path was not significant. What's most interesting, I think, about this particular slide is that for people with high self-enhancement values, they were most happy when they did not have to engage in servant leadership behaviors. So that goes to show you kind of where their headspace is at there. And by contrast, people with low levels of self-enhancement values, they were least pleased when servant leadership behaviors were low. So they have this crave and this drive to enact servant leadership behaviors, and when they're not afforded the opportunity, that really irks them. All right, last 2 slides. I know we're getting close to lunch in the discussions here. So this is the conditional indirect effects. So we tested the indirect effects at high versus low levels of self-enhancement values for our 3 outcomes. I'll direct your attention to this first set of bubbles here. This is at high levels of self-enhancement. People did not experience resource regeneration. No significant relationship there. By contrast, people with high levels or low levels of self-enhancement value experienced heightened levels of resource generation. And most importantly, the difference between the high and low effects was significant. And you can also look at the confidence intervals associated with those differences. So what are the contributions? A couple of them. One is that we examine the bright side, right? The positive effects that can accrue to leaders from enacting servant leadership behaviors. We also illustrate the process through which it occurs. So drawing broaden and build theory highlights the importance of positive affect and how that translates to 3 different categories of resources. We also introduce an important boundary condition, self-enhancement values, to suggest that if you want to experience the benefits associated with servant leadership behaviors, it starts with molding the heart of who a person is. You really have to believe it in order to experience the good that is associated with such behaviors. And then finally, this is the most novel contribution, but we are among some of the first papers to take an actor-centric perspective on the daily fluctuations and the consequences of those daily fluctuations in servant leadership behaviors. With that, thank you very much.